Good evening and welcome to the London School of Economics. My name is Ricky Burdett and I'm a professor of urban studies here at the school. We're here to enjoy and celebrate this wonderful new publication by Richard Rogers and Richard Brown. They're two authors of this wonderful book, which is about the life of one of the two. Richard is far too young to, the other Richard, that one. Richard Brown is far too young to write an autobiography at the moment. It's published by Canongate, who've done a really wonderful job, and I hope many of you get a chance to look at it, possibly even buy it, which you can do at the end of this evening's proceedings. And in fact, Richard will be happy to sign some of the books at the end. If you have them, just come up here and Richard will sign them if you are keen to do that. We will wrap up sometime before 8 p.m., but let me tell you how the evening is going to be organized. I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes or so, a little bit about the book, showing just a few slides of some of the canonical work that Richard and his various practices. At the moment there is one practice which is present in the room, which I'll come to later today. But I'm going to show a few slides of some of the work and just remind ourselves of its power and its significance. Then I will be joined by Amanda Levete, who I'll introduce in a moment, and Alan Yentob, who's stuck in traffic. That's a well-known phrase for many of us in this room to know that he's running a little bit late, but he's going to be here soon. And we're going to have a conversation with Richard, taking some different perspectives of things that are in the book, and actually, interestingly, some things which are not in the book. And I think it's important to also bring some of those issues out. We will then have time after that for questions and answers. And as ever, here at the LSE, there are people with microphones who will come if you put your hand up. And I really encourage everyone in the room, all of you at the back, to feel participant in that. Microphone will come to you. Please say who you are and don't make a long speech. Just ask a question. Or if you've got a statement to make, that's great. But try and keep it concise so that we can get backwards and forwards. And Richard, Alan, when he's here, and Amanda will respond to that. My role is to very much chair the whole discussion and make it work. Now, Richard's life is in the book. We'll talk about it in a moment, but I just want to introduce briefly Amanda and Alan so that we know who he is when he comes. Amanda is an architect who now runs a practice called Amanda Levete Architects, very well known to many at the moment who live and enjoy London because of the exceptional new building, partly an entrance, but much more than an entrance, with galleries and many other facilities known as the Exhibition Road Quarter of the Victoria and Albert Museum. But most importantly, and I guess, Amanda, one of the reasons you're here is because your practice was, you started working with Richard when you started your practice, and then things moved on from there, and I think that's interesting. And Alan Yentob, I think also familiar to many of you in the room, as the director of television at the BBC, the producer, inventor, editor of programs like Arena, Imagine, and many others, who's been a very close friend of Richard and Ruthie's for, I think, up to 40 years, in fact, and has been able to sort of chronicle some of the work, but also the ideas and its impact on wider culture and even the politics of London and the UK. And I think those words are very, very significant, the sort of the politics of art, the politics of architecture, and how they relate. I think that is really significant, because if I ever have to think of an event I want to chair, one event I want to chair in life, right? With my favorite subject, it's this one. Why? It's about architecture in cities, and it's about Richard Rogers. I mean, you know, it doesn't get better than that. What do I mean by that? I mean that the whole understanding of architecture in its wider sense, the physical world and how it relates to the social world, which is exactly what a number of us here at LSE Cities do in our research programs and other colleagues, is very much shaped by the discussions and conversations that we've been having over the years. I don't think it would exist if it weren't for the conversations we've had. So in that sense, it's a very good subject to actually have here at the LSE. Now, apart from turning off the machine, which I don't want to do, I just wanted, as I said, show a few slides which remind us of what the work is about and how powerful, innovative, and still fresh and important and new it is. I mean, many of you will know, will have visited, will have experienced, and I'm sorry it's above your head, but I think you both know this building well, of the Pompidou Center. Just think, this is early 70s, just a few years after the 1968 Paris riots. This is radical stuff built, not just talked about. Completely rethinking the program internally and externally, and going back to the themes that I guess interest us and will no doubt talk about. It's not just the radicality of making this building completely open, hence all the structure and the tubes and the services are outside, but what Richard and his then partner and long life friend Renzo Piano did was actually say, you know what, rather than just put a museum in this urban fabric, why don't we give Paris something that it doesn't have or hasn't had for many, many centuries at that point, a fantastic public space. So this building is much more than just the building. It's about a contribution to the city. So the title of the book, A Place for All People, very much relates to this discussion. And obviously, much of the early parts of the book relate to the fact that Richard spent his early life in two extraordinary cities in Italy, Trieste and Florence, and experiencing places, public spaces of the sort, are very much behind the spirit of what is there. So I think one of the things we want to reflect on is also how does one bring the contemporary without losing the power of the past. And this painting by Masaccio, it could have been Piero della Francesca, it could be many others, about individuals engaging, in this case it's mainly all men, in the public realm of the city as it was then, also says something about not only continuity and engagement in the public realm. It's a little bit of a secret, and we did not compare notes with Richard about what color he would wear tonight, but this notion that, you know, the oranges and the pinks and the greens, there's something about understanding the essence of the past and bringing it forward without it being in any way romantic or backward-looking, which really infuses the work. A few years later, a decade or so later, the Lloyds Building is just as significant, even though in London many people know the outside, not the inside. These two images for me, for us, are striking. Why are they striking? Because they show this extraordinary vast interior. For those of you who are architects, you'll be able to read this cross-section of this vast room, which goes out 6, 7, 10 stories high. But the whole idea about this is this was an institution that was going to change. So it didn't know where it should have floors, where it should have entrances, where it should have desks. And the notion behind this, which was the winning notion for a very young practice, was how can we make this adaptable? How can we therefore connect to future unknowns without having to rebuild the whole thing from scratch? So the notion of public space that we see here is also infects the notion of sort of the publicness of this building and how it connects to the outside. Richard Sennett, who is here, he might have not been here, so I was going to steal one of his sentences, but I will anyway, talks about the importance of Richard's work in actually humanizing technology. And I think we can see it in this and other buildings. And when one thinks about the notion of human and humanity, many of these grand ideas, many of these ideas which apply to some of the bigger scale and larger buildings, I think apply to many of the buildings that the practice has done over the years. And in this case, the Maggie Center, which is for helping patients in their last years of life suffering from cancer, one of a number of wonderful buildings actually designed and sponsored by an organization run by a close friend of Richard and Ruthie's, in fact, uses the notion of transparency, of light, of materials to soften everyday's existence. So the notion of architecture actually being able to soften and humanize life is very much at the heart of what has been done by the different practices that Richard has been engaged in. I just want to end in terms of reintroducing to all of you what the power of Richard's work is, the house that he designed for his mother and father, a house that was designed practically 50 years ago, in Wimbledon. It's just been refurbished. It's been donated by Richard and Ruthie and the family to Harvard University, the Graduate School of Design. Different fellows from different practices actually now come and do research there for 3-4 months a year, so it's actually becoming alive again. And again, this notion that a house designed for a wonderful artist, the mother, the potter, the doctor, the father, the Italian doctor, who was more English than the English, according to the book, which is a wonderful notion. I know a few Italians like that, has actually been changed and adapted. And in fact, what looks like and is a beautiful structure is actually made of what was then totally industrial units. It was stuff that was not available actually in the normal construction industry and brought into the making of a place of, I say, great beauty, great elegance. So this notion of using industry is very much at the heart of what the practice today, Rogers Stirk Harbour, is doing in terms of actually some of the new housing that is being built around London at the moment, where we have an urgent need for such housing. So I've taken a little bit of the time in order to just provide a context for some of the discussions we're going to have. And I thought it would be interesting, and I'll join you at the table, if in a moment I ask Amanda to sort of reflect what it was like actually working in Richard's earlier practices. But before we do that, Alan, welcome. Glad to see you. And said exactly everything about you. And in a moment, perhaps you can join in the conversation to talk about a number of aspects about Richard and his wider context in culture and the arts and politics. But welcome to all, and Amanda.
I just want to try and paint a sketchy picture of what it was like to work in Richard's office. I was there from 84 to 89. I tried to get a job straight after college. I'd had about 3 interviews there. I was convinced I'd get a job, but somehow I didn't. And 2 years later, out of the blue, I got a call from Richard's office. And this was my dream come true. I mean, there was not a better office in London to work in. And on my first day, I remember so clearly, I'm sure you won't, Richard, but walking into a team meeting for a competition, and there was Richard and the team, and Peter Rice, one of the greatest engineers of our time. And I was completely and utterly overwhelmed. But that was the beginning. And being in Richard's office, it was, you were part of the family, you were embraced, you were looked after, you had to work incredibly hard. It was an extremely demanding practice, but you wanted to give of your best. And there were extraordinary people, and there were these famous Monday morning design reviews where, and it was a much smaller office then than it is now. So you could go to these design reviews if you dared, even if you weren't working on that project, just to observe the conversation and the dialogue between Richard and his directors and the team that were presenting the project. But there were always engineers there, not to talk necessarily about the engineering, but who were part of the team who would critique from an engineering, but also from an architectural perspective. And I think that's one of the things that I took away that was so special. And I think Richard was the first person to really do this, elevate engineers to the same level of architects. And these engineers were friends of Richard and actually then became, over the years, friends of mine too. So it was an extremely intellectually exciting place to work, as well as being about great kind of technical design. And there were always interesting people coming through the office who were outside of the discipline of engineering, writers, filmmakers, politicians. It was extraordinary. And of course, to make you feel like family, Richard cared about what you ate. And when I was there, the River Cafe started, and it used to be the office canteen. And it didn't last too long as the office canteen, but it was so emblematic of how Richard wanted us to be part of the community. And I remember having been there Because there's another thing about Richard, and I think it comes through very clearly in this book. You cannot separate Richard's work from the man that Richard is. And I was called to a meeting at Richard's house because he wasn't feeling too well. It was meant to be in the office. And I was still quite new in the office, and I arrived at this fabulous house in Chelsea, and I was a little bit overawed as I walked in. And I was told that Richard was upstairs in bed. So I walked up this amazing, bouncy, wonderful piece of engineering staircase, and there was Richard on the mezzanine, in bed with Ruthie. Both had colds, watching Brief Encounter, crying their eyes out. And I just thought, this is the kind of marriage I want, is what flashed through my mind at that point.
Before we come on to the wider impact on the profession, which I think would be interesting, and Richard, it might be worth sharing with everyone here that this culture in the office that Amanda's just described wasn't by chance. I mean, effectively, you actually have a constitution. There's a very strong sense of what a business ethos should be like. And can you just say a few words, both what that was about, because it's still the case today, but it was very powerful in shaping younger people at the time, and where did it come from in your experience? And maybe you need to bring the microphone.
I guess that the main reason was teamwork. One of the reasons of teamwork was that I have always had teamwork. I have some large-scale problems. I don't draw well. Most people can't read my writing. What else can I say and so on? So other people can do it better than I can. So we would all get together. I've also been, I suppose it's part of the whole concept of being a humanist, that the profession is not all that you do. You go work outside the profession. And it's about life. I mean, architecture is a social work. It's social and art. And of course, science plays an important part in that. So the whole concept of sharing. When I started, I looked at some of the sort of people who might do the same type of thing. We wanted to become a charity, or we wanted to give our office up as so that we could become a charity. There was no way that we were allowed to do it at first. We really had to fight for it. But we did find that some of the big stores, some plastic makers and so on, had elements. So we borrowed those elements and we created this constitution, which is all about a way of life.
Give some details.
Directors or partners, depending what stage you're when you're looking at your organization, can't earn more than 9 times the lowest paid architect after 2 years. It talks about we won't do work on what we call, I suppose, war work. I mean, there's some fine lines here, which are difficult to define. The idea that everybody should participate we go away together. In those days, perhaps not quite, by that time, not quite. I remember that when it was sunny, we'd all fall into, we had one mini with moss growing in the windows, and there were about 6 of us, and we'd all fall into that and drive to the nearest, to Brighton when there was sun, and leave some poor secretary to man man the phones. The idea was to humanize. That's a word and democratize. These are words which I greatly enjoy. Where do they come from? I don't know. I mean, I suppose maybe you could argue now that you look back at the Renaissance and there are elements, but I think being human is sort of pretty, we can't avoid it. The question is, how do you interpret that humanity?
But you could say maybe a little bit more about that historical connection with Italy, because I was struck, I said it before, that in a book of X 100 pages, your reference, your attachment to history for someone who's so much propelled towards the future and gives us a great sense of optimism was actually, to me, refreshingly new.
Yeah, can I say something about this? I think this is really interesting what we're talking about, because we're having a conversation, and with Richard it's always a conversation. It's not excluding architecture from our daily lives. It's all part of our lives. I mean, anyone who visits Italy cannot imagine that environment doesn't mean something to everyone who's in it. But the other idea about modernism is very important. There was always modernism. When Richard takes you, as he has taken me on countless occasions, probably you, round Florence, his apartment where he was born looks over Brunelleschi's dome. Brunelleschi was a modernist in his moment. And we're all modernists, because what is modernism about? It's about growing up. It's about the future. It's about looking forward. But it's also about living within a context. Living within, with having a legacy that you can actually live. We have to be compatible with each other. These ideas of fairness are also part of the same idea that, architecture doesn't live out there. I was saying to Ricky earlier that really and truly, in the there was clearly there was an amazing moment about when modernism was invented, and it was just extraordinary, and it was to do with science and technology as well as it was to do with art and with even with literature, but with all kinds of ideas about the future, exciting ideas about the future. But actually they sort of we lost sight of those things. And although the world that Richard entered when he arrived in Britain in the war years, and post 45 was actually a very progressive era with Bevan and the National Health Service and Morrison and things.
LSE.
Yeah, the LSE. But somehow or other, certainly in terms of architecture and in terms of modern art, Britain was sort of floundering somewhat. It was sort of preoccupied with other things. It wasn't interested. And I think this is particularly important in relation to the breadth now of our interests. People now know the names of architects. They never had any idea before. The word architecture was sort of a bit of a mystery. What does that mean? There are buildings. But actually, I believe that the Pompidou was the first thing to make people go, oh my God, what is that? And look where it's sitting. Look where it is. How did that happen? And that really, I think, was an extraordinary moment.
Let's take, you've made a number of points. Let's just take that context, Richard, and go back to the where you were brought up and how that, because that's interesting to unpack for us. How did it affect?
Let me first of all say, I think, and I'm always saying, all good architects are modern in their times.
Yeah.
I mean, and I just quickly to quote, where we were opening Lloyds of London, and I was being heavily attacked by the press for change of the media, and I sat next to the Dean of St. Paul's, and he told me this story, which I think every architect should learn by heart. And he said, when Wren was 70, he realized he was getting to the end of his life. He'd been working on St. Paul's for 40 years. He was so fed up that when he built the last one, he put a 20-foot wattle fence all the way around it so that nobody could see it. Nothing changes. I'm not allowed to put a wattle fence, but sometimes I sure feel like putting a wattle fence around one's buildings. It's the surprise. Technology has always changed architecture, it's changed economics, and it's changed society. I mean, what a fantastic jump from the cave, haven't forgotten Florence, from the cave to the primitive hut, and from the primitive hut to the first great cities along the Euphrates and in that part of the world. And I think we learn from all these things. We learn that we are part of a continuity, and we can pick certain parts which helps us. In terms of Florence, yes, I was lucky. I was very fortunate. I chose the right parents. My father was a doctor, as you heard, and my mother was a potter. I chose a great city to be born in, and I've enjoyed it greatly ever since, and I go back there because all those elements which we all use, we started by talking about the Pompidou Piazza. I'm told that the reason we got the Pompidou competition was primarily because of the other 680 entries. Nobody had a big usable public space, where ours was over half the site. And I think that comes back from the Piazza della Signoria, some markers and so on. Obviously, I didn't think in those big scales. In fact, one of the reasons I didn't want to do, it's a long story, so I won't go into it, but one of the reasons I was the one...
It's fine.
One of the reasons that when Renzo and I and Ted Heppels...
Ted was the engineer, Renzo Piano, the design...
I'm sorry. And Ted was Group 4 at Arabs. They wanted to do, I and Sue, my wife at that time, didn't want to, and we lost the vote. But the reason we didn't want to, one of the reasons we didn't want to, the last thing we felt we wanted to do was a monument for a president. I mean, the idea of doing a monument even for Pompidou. And we thought it's going to become a city hall, and we don't want to do this. And we like the whole concept of Mirabeau, the Minister of Culture under de Gaulle, who had decided that there should be cultural centres in each major city. And we thought that was going to sink that idea. So we voted against. Luckily, democracy won, we lost, and the building got built, so we were wrong.
Before I come back to Amanda in terms of the relationship to the profession and innovation, Richard, in the book, you make a reference to this wonderful square in Piazza della Signoria in Florence, which we all go and take lots of photographs, assuming that it was all perfectly designed at one point in time. Yes, exactly. Right? In fact, the buildings are, not one of them are lines, I think, not one of them is next and the same height as the other ones. And you make a very interesting point about the difference between working with an existing older building that you need to respect and having the courage, and this will go back to the issue of innovation in a moment in architecture, to actually do something radically new, a la Rennes. Do you want to expand on that?
I'm about to do a talk in New York, which I'm going to do it on harmony. And it starts by saying there are two types of harmony. Now, there's a whole series in between. There's harmony through contrast. Pompidou, many of the buildings, I mean, your point about the major buildings, specifically the Palazzo Vecchio with that big spire, and of course St. Marco's is the best place with that crazy clock tower with its green tiles with an amazingly white background, and yet with 1,000 years of different development around. Nothing is like anything else. So that is mainly by contrast, and some part is through fitting into that environment. Interestingly enough, the ideal example in Palazzo della Signoria is if you look at the Uffizi, that really does break the boundaries of that time. It's a late Michelangelo, it's a beautiful building, it's done by Vasari. If you go around the other side of the Palazzo Vecchio, which is basically a medieval building, and there's actually a little wing practically, and you can't see it. And then you realize that Vasari used two different techniques. When he was repairing the building more and extending its side, he did it exactly the same as the Palazzo. So exactly, I can't find the actual gap between the Palazzo Vecchio, and then when he moves around to the museum, he uses his architecture. I feel that is a very good way. Now, there are things in between, but I do like that clarity of language. As far as Florence, it was very conscious of its architecture. Again, quote from one of the many letters that I was once sent, which pointed out to a letter that had been written in Florence about the Strozzi Tower. And it was 8 stories tall, probably 5, it's 8 in terms of if you really work at it. And people were complaining about it being too high. So that too is not a new thing about building too high, so-called. Height has gone on up, and height isn't a problem in itself. It's how you handle height.
We'll come back to that, I'm sure, when maybe we talk about London, and there are bound to be questions about that issue from the floor. But Amanda, taking forward your notion of what working in that environment meant for you, and you then went on and set up a practice with Jan Kaplitzky, Future Systems, and then now your own practice. You've been also observing in a way how the culture of architecture itself has changed, and that actually there's maybe more freedom than in other countries where there's a sort of more slavish orthodoxy about even modernism, which is what I think Alan was talking about in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think Richard's work, particularly with Pompidou, which I regard as one of the most important buildings of the 20th century, completely changed forever how the whole world would view museums and galleries. These were places that were intimidating, that you felt not maybe entitled to go into. And with Pompidou, first of all, this kind of incredibly radical move of giving over half of the site to a public piazza, but to create a building where even to ride the escalators had as much validity as to go in and see an exhibition. I mean, that was a massively radical move. And we would not have the museums that we have now were it not for Pompidou. And if you if you take something like Tate Modern, very, very different building and a conversion, but there is a parallel there, which is that
Completely.
vast sloping floor down into the turbine space. That would never have happened without Pompidou. Guggenheim Bilbao would never have happened without Pompidou, because
Why? That's not obvious to.
because there was an understanding of the huge regenerative, social and financial spin-off from a building as audacious as Pompidou and what it could do to a district. And, this was a part of Paris that was very depressed, that was very poor, and around Pompidou started, any number of cafes and restaurants. It became a district. And the iconography of it, the identification of Paris, a beautiful city, but suddenly the identification of Paris wasn't just about history, it was about modernity. And although, we talk about the Bilbao effect, it's not really the Bilbao effect, for me, it's the Pompidou
I think
effect.
what Richard was saying, the Uffizi is the Bilbao of the time. in a way.
I want to pick up what Amanda said
I think
about
that's very important.
Tate Modern, because it's very interesting, because we're talking about modernism, and most of the people in this room now can talk about architecture in the same vein as they would talk about art and other things, and the two are interactive, integrated, and Amanda has just done a wonderful extension to the V&A. But the interesting thing about this is that there was also a crisis in the art world in Britain in the 1980s, and you will all remember this, or some of you, old enough to remember, will remember the bricks debacle where people were outraged that the Tate was buying bricks. The Tate did not buy or acquire any valuable art at any point. Tate Modern had very little when Richard, on the board of the Tate, appointed Nick Sirota to do that job. So what did he do? He created a destination with the Tate Modern, a place where ideas could flourish, where Bruce Nauman could have a sound event, where people were able to interact with new ideas. But actually the collection of the Tate and the Tate Modern was not that great, but the place became an absolute sort of, and I completely agree with Amanda that it was what the Pompidou had achieved that made that possible. And I think, that issue of modernism and Britain being able to embrace it and not sort of be in denial about it was a very important moment in the 80s, and we've seen London flourish in many ways since then, and when it had been in decline in the 70s and actually even in the 60s.
And this the impact of Pompidou continues, and not just Pompidou, but even at a smaller scale, the DRU building that you did, the roof extension, Yellow Submarine, and Jan Kapitsky did this very kind of famous photomontage of a car on top, and without that, I doubt we'd have the Herzog de Meuron Philharmonie Elba, which is exactly the same idea. Take a very ordinary building and put something extraordinary and audacious on top. And so I feel that your influence is not, it's still there. It's because some of this work, it was so raw, was so urgent. And it's that kind of shifts debates and makes progress.
That's just like, I think we're all trying to shift debate, but I think you're overdoing it, by the way.
That's the point of tonight.
I mean, the story of St. Paul's is in itself shifting the debate. In other words, it was rejected by Londoners. In terms of where London was, I was shocked when I came. I was 5 when I came from Italy in '39, and as I became older, I was shocked how little art there was. And there was no question the modern art was sort of frowned upon. We had that old story about, my donkey could do better with its tail than Picasso, or whatever it was.
Picasso exhibition of 45.
And there was that was a general, and that was said by a senior person. And many people have felt that, and the shock of the new was pretty horrific. So in those terms, it was. Though on the other hand, we had fantastic theatre, great writing and so on. Somehow the visual arts was very much behind. London started to change quite early on after that. The big gap, there's no question, that the big change came with Nick Serota, with Saatchi, with Goldsmiths. That period was a moment of a burst of creativity. But I do want to come back to the fact that it has always been bursts of creativity, and Duchamp was a lot earlier than we were, for instance.
So I want to just connect this burst of energy, burst of expression to some of your, I think, very interesting moments in the book where you talk about your early trips to the States. Right? So brought up in Italy, come to a dark and damp basement as opposed to the view of the Florence Dome.
But let's not forget his arrival in Manhattan, and seeing that extraordinary sight.
But remind, it's in the book, it's beautifully put, how you get on a ship, go with your wife, Sue, at that point, across the ocean and arrive at?
Absolutely blown out of my mind, because having been an appalling student all my life, I suddenly sort of understood where I was going the last year, helped by Peter Smithson, who was my year master. I managed to get to Yale as a Fulbright student. That's I and Sue. When I arrived in the States, leaving Southampton and looking down from the Queen, Elizabeth, I can't remember which one it was, and looking down, and the scale was amazing. The people with bicycles and little brown hats, and the baggage would go on the front, on the front wheel, and then arriving in New York and seeing these buildings 1,000 times, it felt 1,000 times taller than yourself. And it was more, I think, dramatic then because there was no Wall Street at the beginning. So the hill went upwards. The lower parts, the buildings were lower and they were on the waterfront. But as the hill went up, you didn't realize the hill went up, so the buildings looked even taller because they were sitting on the hill. And I shall never forget that. And then, of course, moving from that into the whole industrial age of New York and other cities, which we were on such a small scale in comparison. And that was a tremendously enlightening period.
That's where the Richard Sennett point about actually taking a technology which belonged to another world of industry, of silos and other things which you, Norman Foster and others who were traveling together at the time found exciting. You actually, in a way, brought that into a discussion of architecture which was not there. It was an interesting appropriation in many ways, which of course, Alan, was happening in art and in other ways.
But we took it in to solve a social problem. The social problem at that time, was, shall we say, growth and change. Again, going back to Lloyds, the first statement to us when we did Lloyds, which was the second major building we did when we were younger, was we want a building that can change. And we're not in the building business, but we've changed building 4 times since the war, and we don't want to do it again. Building had been unable to cope with change. So if you want to do change, you're unlikely to use brick. I'm not saying that brick is wrong, but for that specific use, it's not a very logical use. Ditto the Pompidou Center. The idea was that you could create a framework which you could not only change inside, there were no columns on the inside, there were no mechanical services, but on the outside you could change pieces. And so you had a framework in which change could take place. And so in that sense, again, the democratizing of the building.
Is it worth asking, one of the challenges that face us all, and obviously Richard has been preoccupied with urban spaces and cities and how they're managed and how you get things done and achieved, and the big challenge of recent years of social housing and how you deal with it. And it does seem extraordinary to me that this problem has arisen, and somehow or other you ask yourself, and you've been battling with it for ages, and have been examining. You did the Wreath Lectures in which you tried to put a proposition forward. In fact, you spent the last 20 years of your life arguing about trying to make urban spaces work for people, for everyone. Do you feel, do you have any confidence that we're going to start addressing that problem? And what about architects like you, Amanda, and Richard, what can you do to help ensure that, you know, there is a place for people in the cities?
Well, I in our own work, and I have obviously been influenced hugely by Richard, in two recent projects, both of them museum projects, the V&A, where the most radical move is to create a courtyard, not a building, but to create a courtyard and a different relationship between the museum and the street, and break down that barrier. And to create a place that just belongs to London, that you can hang out in. You don't have to go to the museum. I mean, that came very much from the sort of thinking around the Pompidou, and at the museum that we completed last year in Lisbon, MAT, where we created a new public space on the roof for a very different reason, because the building had been cut off from the city and the riverfront. But this idea that public outdoor spaces have as much, if not more, agency than the buildings themselves is
in the end,
something that,
Amanda, either for your projects or Richard's, it depends on a client or someone paying for this, right? And allowing. Do you feel, Richard, taking Alan's point further, that you've been able, in your political positions, I mean, there are few architects I know who've sat on boards as diverse as we say, you know, from the Urban Task Force for Government or the Take, that the culture of commissioning has changed as a result of some of your banging on for the last 20 years?
I mean, one has to be, to use sort of an Italian word, furbo, clever, and one has to negotiate with the local authorities. We have to persuade them to give us. We've just, Rogers Stirk Harbour have just finished Leadenhall, which we're now occupying a floor. That was a negotiation to get the ground floor basically 7 stories up, and then to get a park underneath it, or a square underneath it, which moves on to the next side. It was a mixture of negotiation. Negotiations, first of all, for the developer, and then secondly, with the local authorities. So to have that space, but not lose money, because the developers are in the business of making money. So you have to make that confidence, make them confident, and also feel that maybe they can get a bit more anyhow by lifting that building up and making it more unique. That maybe give it a little bit more rent. But actually, most of the work has to be done between the local, the political element and the architectural. And I think architecture has got a lot of power. Of course, he often loses. That's part of the game. And there are some boroughs.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that because of the power of the capitalist society, our tendency is always to say we make money is the number one thing. Of course, not at the LSE, but at other places. But there is a feeling.
There are a few here. Yes.
Therefore, the tendency is to squeeze as much out of whatever site you've got. But there are questions you can ask. What you're meant to be as an architect, thinking about people first and foremost, is what do you need? Now, I often say, in fact, I've said in that book, it should be a right for everybody to have a public space, starting on the doorstep, or the stoop, as the Americans call it, so you can sit down, you can have a bench, a tree, and so on. It should be a right of everybody to see a tree. These are rights, but it doesn't. But if you're only looking at money, one forgets the rights. So somehow you have to paint a picture to enthuse the, let's say, the developer or the client. And by the way, as far as I'm concerned, all our good buildings are done for clients who are interesting clients. If you don't have an interesting client, you've got a real problem. Interesting client isn't someone who says yes, it's someone who says probably no, but if you've got a no, at least you can work your way around it. The real problem is when the client actually is not very interested. Therefore, as far as he's concerned, he just wants the box. So I think you have to negotiate with the people you're working with. That's how you get it.
I mean, this story, this perspective of yours reminds me of a very, very concrete story about roughly 20 years ago. We were working together in an organization called the Architecture Foundation. And this, you've got to think of 95, it would have been 10 years without any form of representation of governance in London, because Mrs. Thatcher in her wisdom had abolished it. So we organized some public debates with, in fact, nearly 2,500 people showed up once a month to actually debate London, to have a voice, and Alan was one of the trustees that actually made that happen. And at that event, Richard, and I want to, in a way, say, can one have an influence on a city? At that event, you got up and said, why is it that London, and remember, that was 95, it's not that long ago, all the public spaces are bloody roundabouts? That was the phrase you used, right?
Never.
Yeah. And since we didn't have a mayor then, we had John Gummer, who was the remember him, the hamburger guy. He was sitting there, and effectively, I think you said, show of hands, who would like, to see Parliament Square and Trafalgar Square turned into a proper people place? And lo and behold, 99% put their hands up. That actually triggered, and it's in the book. So say a little bit more about that story, because that had an impact.
Yeah, but I don't think that my point is not that you can't have an impact, and I think the people, who in a way, of course, their interest is the people as those 2,000 people in the hall. They weren't thinking about their pocket. They were thinking about how do we improve that society. Many, by the way, I'm told, were actually people who own taxis. It doesn't matter what it is. People want to have beautiful cities because it gives comfort. Also, that people want to have cities where you can have housing, but not just housing, affordable housing. So these are problems which everybody tends to say yes. It's the difficulty is to get the government and especially the financial structure to give those elements, which we all agree about. I don't know. Does anyone dare to put up a hand and say, I hate public space?
Well, many people say, I hate public space, which is actually privately owned. But anyway.
Yes, that I agree. I should have said that.
Yeah. Alan, I think you were going to comment on this issue?
No, I suppose we're looking at a challenge which is getting greater and greater. And despite the fact that we now have a mayor of London, one wonders how empowered he is. He's just made a decision to provide a space in the city, hasn't he, for development on the basis that it will be for social housing and that the cost of that housing will be limited. And also the other challenge we have is the juxtaposition in the creation of communities. What happens in this public space? Who do you encounter in this public space? And the danger that you begin to develop social housing outside the urban space, the urban space which is valuable to developers and others and elsewhere. And I don't quite know what the answer to this is and whether.
Yeah, but what's interesting, and I don't quite understand where the money's coming from, but it seems interesting about the Sadiq's initiative is that it is social housing for social housing's sake. It is not on the back of a private development.
Correct, yeah, exactly that.
And that's
and
a big sea change.
It is. Now, that is a fascinating issue. It's exactly right what Amanda says. Normally, you're told, you can do this as long as you do some social housing as well, but that's not what he's done. And the question is that a solution that can be. And obviously the issue of public space is one that can be embraced as well as that. But is that something that we are seeing just one example of, or is it something that could be extended? I don't know. What do you think?
It can certainly be extended. We've gone through a series of phases through the 50 years where I'm talking about it as far as my life. After the war, local authorities, for instance, the GLA had 3,000 architects. I'm not sure whether it has 3 now, but but just to give you the power, and I'm not saying the architects had given the solution, but it gives you a tone of the situation. And and I say architects, there were also planners and engineers working towards a more livable city, which is the whole concept of that period of welfare state.
Wanted to work.
Absolutely, that's the place. And in fact, everybody, I was going to say 80% in my opinion, and I have never made that calculation, 80% when I was at the AA, 80% of the architects worked for schools, hospitals, towns, new towns, and so on. With a social vision. Today it's reversed. But there is change, and Ken came in and said, okay, and Richard Brown and I both were advisors to Ken, and one of the things we worked out was, let's say, tell the developers, yes, you can do it, but you can only build housing yourselves as long as you put one social, or affordable as it was then called, for every 2 private houses. That was a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, in a way, the tendency was always to pull it out, but at least it had to be done theoretically in the postal code. That probably meant 2 miles of that area. The idea was right. We never quite got there, and then people started saying, but that puts the prices of land up. as it obviously does. Because if you're going to do it that way, in other words, you're going to force prices down in certain areas. And obviously the same thing is going to be said about this. There will be somebody's got to pay for it. If the government is willing to pay for it, and I think we should be welcoming good taxes, then we have to be taxed more to get what we want out of, inverted commas, the livable city.
And this links very, very strongly. We might go back a moment to your parents on arriving in London, to that period of the immediate post-war. You mentioned already the London School of Economics and the beginning of the welfare state, the various institutions that at the moment are challenged, as we well know, National Health Service and many others. And you've mentioned the fact that and you talk about this a bit in the book, that there's been an erosion of the profession. But I think we've got to be careful to be negative, because I have to say, in rereading the book, or in a way re-listening to you talk about things, there is this extraordinary optimism that comes out. I mean, there is a risk sometimes to have this conversation, and that optimism is also about that actually you can create the physical framework, and maybe that's, Alan, what you were getting at, around which then other things can happen. You can't design, you can't plan everything, but you can actually. And this is how a little bit we see it in the work we do, you can certainly design things to become antisocial. So if that's true, you can also design things that actually engender inclusion and other things.
The line of optimism is true, isn't it? Because actually London, in the last 10 years, is a far more congenial city to live in. Even an outside spaces is not exactly what Rich is talking about, but of course, when did anyone sit outside in London 25 years ago? They never did, So what's the difference between Paris and London in the sense that, the weather is much the same and all the rest of it? But we have now, our streets are more occupied by people. They're not just places for going from one place to another. There are spaces which are now occupied by people speaking to each other, and they want to live in an environment which is pleasing as well.
So, Richard, take us through these 50 years of London.
London was amazing. It's my memory of London, especially after the war, was amazingly isolated, very poor, which makes it, and I'll come back, that's amazing that we decided on this, that we would accept the welfare state at a point where we were truly poor. I mean, Germany, France, much of Europe was getting money from the States for the bombing, and rightly so. But the Marshall Plan. We weren't in that during. So it was actually, in one sense, a tough time. Of course, rationing actually saved us. England has never been healthier. The gap between the top and the bottom has never been smaller than that period after the war. But there was an idealism about a better nation, and it took a long time. My memory of starting working, and actually as a student, is that people rushing across Waterloo Bridge, wearing a black bowler hat always, and their suits and so on, going to work, and then rushing out. There was nowhere to stop. Yes, there were clubs, male only and expensive, and there were pubs, more or less male only. So where the hell would you stop? And now, of course, the cafe. I use the cafe as a general road. The whole thing of talking on of benches and so on. Trafalgar Square has been pedestrianised, and there are a massive number of people. And London has got immense power. London now competes probably with any major city in the world, which is certainly where it wasn't there in 1945, 1946. So we could be optimistic as long as we are not extremely complacent and economically driven. And of course, I mean, the two things which as a young man, I used to think will never happen, this is when I was 20, is A, nationalism, and we are seeing that rearing its head, and that's a dangerous element, and of course extreme religion as well. So we're seeing these extremists, and those extremists could kill us, all that optimism which I'm talking about off.
But I think one of the most important things that I've learned from you, Richard, and I'm not alone in this, is that, and I think, it speaks of optimism, is that it is our responsibility as architects to be radical, and it's our responsibility of architects to have an impact beyond the confine of the building. Yeah. And I think, if you look at the younger generation of architects, they are much more socially engaged. than previous generations. I do think that despite the Brexit looming, I do think that there is cause for optimism.
I think you may be right, though I do think we need to change the education radically. We need to stop having architects only learn about buildings, but learn about what we've been discussing, the whole idea of solving problems. That we are in the business of, designing roofs over people, which is a place for all people. The name of the book comes out of the first paragraph, as I said before, from the Pompidou, a place for all people, all ages, all creeds. And I think we have to recognize that's what we're serving.
Right, we have now about 15 minutes for comments or questions. So there are microphones both at the upper level and at the lower level. And we might want to take, one or two questions together. Please direct them at Richard or Alan or Amanda. And as I said, say who you are. It's good so that we all know, and be concise, please. So are there any questions from the floor? There's one coming up here. So could we have, hello, microphone? So one over here, and we can start with the lady with the orange.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Want to
this
stand
is.
up?
Oh
Yeah.
gosh, really? Okay. Hi.
Is it?
See, up there. Richard.
This is for
Thank you.
Richard,
Sorry. Oh, that's
and I'm Sarah. Out of all of the projects that you've worked on, what's the one that never came to life that you really wish had have done?
Wait, answer that directly, I guess.
Me?
Yes.
Me? I'm not sure I can say that, but I suppose in terms of London, we did that exhibition, which sort of, I suppose, did start the ball rolling at the Royal Academy, London as it could be, where we tried to create a more livable city. But it's a difficult one. I mean, we've done a number of different buildings which we never managed to build. I don't know. I would like to think that that the architect's life would be such that that everybody, and I'm just one, that builds. I mean, if we build 1 out of 20 buildings, I think I'm being optimistic, and that is pretty tough.
Yeah, wow. Question over there. Can you stand up?
Hi, my name's Ben. Thank you very much for an interesting talk and a lifetime of inspiring architecture. I wanted to ask about the social problems, and for me, one of the things that's quite sad is we've talked a lot today about brilliant set-piece architecture, and we haven't talked about the day-to-day architecture of the building in London. And it seems to me that a lot of London is being built without influence or any input from architects, which I find quite sad. And we're losing some gems like the Robin Hood estate in East London, which I went to see before it got knocked down. And how, as architects, do you make sure that the state and private enterprise has a bigger role in architecture and can influence the way we live in buildings?
Participate. March, whatever. I don't know any other way. You have to actually act. And I think that's the way. In a way, we may have lost some of that. I mean, obviously, again, the war created a situation where people were more willing to act. But I think we just have to. I don't mind whether you write articles or whether you had debates like this. There has to be more of them. There are a lot of people out there, including our own mayor right now, who need our power, need to feel that we want what we're all talking about, a better London. And that goes for the simple house as well as the pedestrianising Trafalgar Square.
I mean, you talked about, doing more as an architect than designing buildings
Yes.
and solving problems. I think that we, as architects, we have to become more entrepreneurial, and we can create our own projects. We can find our own clients. We should be finding the people to pay for projects and just define the projects that we want to do and make them happen. It's perfectly possible. There's a huge amount of money out there, and you just need to be resourceful and entrepreneurial and be your own client, create your own project.
I think what Richard says as well is true, but actually it's not just the professionals who have to speak. London belongs to everyone. It belongs to all the people here, and those voices need to be heard. And we're living in a world where politicians now are going to be obliged to listen. There's a lot of noise out there, and there are a lot of means to make your voice heard. So I think there need to be communities of interest where communities say, well, we've seen what's happened with Grenfell and we've seen the calamity that has brought about and the questions it has raised. And I think you need to use that opportunity to take power, to speak out, particularly in whatever communities you are or whatever your, those issues are which concern you. And clearly, public space, social housing, equality and opportunity. These things are incredibly important, and there now is a moment when governments can be challenged. And as Richard says, Sadiq Khan wants to do stuff. I don't know how empowered mayors are, but they're certainly a lot more empowered if they have the public behind them.
Yeah. There are a lot of strings from central government.
They're less empowered than practically any nation I know, actually.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're not really.
That's one. Can you stand up?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name is William Wong. I'm a photographer. But I've got a question actually via SMS from my best friend who can't be here, so it's quite interesting. It's about chaos theory. So I'm not going to read from my phone, but the gist is she thinks the increasing dense clusters of high-rise you see everywhere in the city and across major cities in the world, causing all this wind tunnel effect, aren't they exacerbating the effects of climate change? And she wonders whether architects actually feel responsible for that. But that's what she asked me to ask you.
Whether tall buildings are exacerbating.
Yeah. I'm not a chaos theory expert.
Opposed to coal-fired stations in China.
I do wonder what you might have to say. But
I don't know whether we have the expertise here to answer. But
I'm happy to answer a bit of that question. That is the compact city is extremely efficient in terms of climate change, which is a critical problem. I mean, a sprawling town uses 3 times as much, or suburbia, if you like, energy as a compact town. It doesn't mean you have to have tall buildings, which in a way it doesn't answer. I'm always saying Barcelona is the most dense city in Europe, and the density gets pretty close to Manhattan sort of density, because it's got a bloody good plan, and no building is more or less higher than 8 stories. So planning is a lot to do it. Height is, we've always had higher buildings. I doubt whether you can prove the point you've made, but certainly one should always test out on the winds around one's buildings. Whether a single building is better than a sprawl, I don't know.
Is that gentleman?
okay, we have 1, 2, and then 3. So second there. Since Alan Stanton will not say this, he was one of the members of the team that designed the Pompidou Center. So I'll say it instead. Is it working? If not, we can go here and then come back. Yeah.
Actually, he is going to say that.
Okay.
I just think it's so refreshing.
Keep it close. We can't hear you. Wait. Can we change microphone? Can we change microphone? Or turn it on?
No,
No, okay. Okay, we'll have that. Meanwhile, we're going to have... Here we go. Alan is coming just behind you.
Number 2, does that work? Yeah. Okay. No, I'm just saying it's so refreshing to hear Richard say that the education of architects need to re-emphasize the importance of what we're designing as buildings for people. And there's been this huge emphasis on what buildings look like. Now, the aesthetics of architecture are terribly important, but there's this kind of preoccupation with the image quality of building rather than what buildings actually do and how they function and how they improve people's lives. And I can remember Joseph Rickworth said, an architect always has 2 clients. He has the client who's paying for the building, but he also has the public as his other client. So we have to bear that in mind. And my memory of the working on the Pompidou Center, which I did with Richard and Renzo many, many years ago, it was a time when Richard and I perhaps worked most closely together over a number of years, and we were fighting to protect the building or the kind of integrity of the building against institutional conservatism, which always tended to try and push it into the way of protecting the building and turning it into a much more conventional space, principally on the Piazza, which we saw as a public space. So we put a lot of time in trying to get the flower market, the circus, and all the rest of it onto that space. As it turned out, we needed hardly have worried. It just, from day one, it just became full of activity, which was absolutely wonderful. But there was that kind of battle, is how do you make spaces that are really going to work for people? And that is a real craft, and it's a really important craft for architecture.
I'd just like to add one thing. Thank you, Alan. And that is, it lost some of its power the moment that Leao was reorganized and there was a lot of public space there. And the point I'm trying to make, in other words, you suddenly enlarged, the space became too big for that whole area in a way. Though it's still a fantastic space. It does imply that obviously architecture has to go beyond the building you're building. You have to have some responsibility for a much bigger area.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you. My name is Marcus Wilcox. I agree with the panel that over perhaps the past decade or two, the public realm in London has seen new uses and new levels of engagement that it hadn't seen previously. But arguably that new use is reaching a decreasing demographic of people who are perhaps economically disposed to fit into the cafe culture that the private realm seems to be promoting. And I wonder if what's the new way to sort of avoid a discord between the new desire for social housing floating off in one direction while what we're actually doing in the public realm isn't serving those communities and the wider diversity of communities. Not everyone wants to drink coffee in a public space. Some people want to undertake other activities in public spaces.
I do believe that's an incredibly important space. I mean, we don't want two worlds out there. And I believe it does require government and local authorities to take responsibility, frankly. I mean, we shall see what happens. I mean, there's also a paradox here that one of the arguments about what happened in Notting Hill is that, you know, that there are these two worlds and they confront one another in the same place. And there certainly was an attempt more recently to take some of these old buildings, including Grenfell and others, well, Grenfell may not have been the one, and to adapt them to for a more prosperous sales to others, and then export the social housing to other parts. I think that would be disastrous, personally. So I think that has to be one of the challenges. But unless there is a chorus of people saying, we don't want to leave, and you've got to address our needs as well, and the city is for us all, and we can't have these two worlds sort of, we need to cohabit, then I think there'll be a problem.
But Richard, Amanda, let's answer the same question. Where does design come into it, if at all?
Well, I was going to answer it not through design, actually, just through an example, a very different city, but the mayor of Porto, as Porto is becoming regenerated and a lot of foreign investors were coming in and buying the buildings and local people were being forced out. They could no longer afford the rents. He made a policy that no more buildings would be sold and no building that foreign investors would be hugely taxed, penalizing taxes, and he bought back buildings and he said, yes, I could spend all this money and I could build a bridge, which is like a lot of mayors do, but what would I have? I'd have a bridge and I wouldn't have the people, the very people who made this city so exciting, the reason that people want to come to this city. And he is, in a very radical way, he is just buying back and giving apartments and buildings, refurbishing them and giving them back to not just key workers, but to the baker, to the butcher, to the people whom, a city depends. And it's having an impact. But
Richard?
That's policy, it's not design.
Richard, on that point?
Are you saying what can architects do? I suppose one of the things we have to think of, as architects, we're actually citizens first and foremost. So architects is a sort of thing that we that the RIBA gives us in this country. But we have a role as a citizen of the society, and I think we have to play it. There's no question that government has a lot of potential, but we're going through an age where it's actually, we want less government, and the less government we're going to have, the less good is the city going to be. And if we look at the cities we like, whether it's Porto or whether it's Florence, or wherever it is at those high points, there was a lot of government. And I think in the end, if I had to say, the most difficult problem that we're going through, and you all know it, especially at the LSE, is inequality. And there's tremendous inequality, and the rich get richer and richer, and they give a little bit of money, but there's nowhere near the sort of money that we're talking about. So we have to find another way. It has to be taxes, and there can't be ways of avoiding taxes.
Yeah.
Okay, so last two questions. Here and then over there.
Every country, every city is different. Porto is not London. Sajid Khan is not the mayor of Porto. I write about street markets and street market buildings, and I've traveled around the world and I've profiled how food and markets and a local economy has been destroyed by money coming in. The Rotterdam Food Hall has disenfranchised many of the local food traders. The very thing you're talking about, a regeneration or a resurgence of people or venues for people to interact, I think is, in my opinion, is double talk, because what you're really doing in London and other cities, excepting Porto and maybe a few others, is allowing for the destruction of local places for local people. You're bringing in, as this gentleman said behind me, the cafe culture. It's all very organized, it's very expensive. You can sit out if you spend £5 or £10 on a coffee and a piece of cake or something. This is very different from the local markets and from the local market culture. Florence is a great exception. The Florentine life, that's a city I'd love to live in. The Florentine life is still it's very much a people's town, very much a people's city. But not many cities still are people's cities. There have been huge fights in London where the developers of Smithfield Market, of Spitalfield, of all of them have come in and tried to take over. People have tried to push them back. It hasn't worked.
Right, thank you very much. And last question over there, and then we'll answer both together. Thank you very much for that. Just over there, put your hand up. Wait, move. And maybe we can just wrap up with a few comments. Yeah.
No idea what we're wrapping up.
Thank you. Christian Jalki. The Rees lecture was briefly mentioned prior. I re-listened to some of them yesterday, especially number 5, and something which goes through it in your talks at the time, and that's 95, so it's 22 years ago, was sustainability, which hasn't come up today so far. It's very important to me, not only in architecture, but in all walks of life, transport, energy, and so on and so on. So you were very progressive and optimistic 22 years ago. You've been living in the city. You know what's been happening. How is it about with your optimism and your how you see it today?
So these two very positive comments about cities are turning the wrong way and not addressing people, and why haven't we talked about sustainability? Why don't you all perhaps reflect on them and with closing comments? Alan, would you like to comment on either? Then Amanda and then Richard.
Sustainability is the big picture, isn't it? I mean, how do we create and sustain a city, an urban culture which is fair, which is progressive, which it creates communities and doesn't undermine them? And that's what you're saying now. And one of the dangers, I live in an area which it's happening in, like Notting Hill Gate is, there is a moment in the middle period when things feel natural and great, and there's a bit of Notting Hill called Goulburn Road, which takes you into Kensal Rise and beyond that, which has got a multicultural feel, is great, but it's being taken over by people who are investing in it and trying to turn it into something else. Westbourne Grove completely transformed now in a bad way.
Okay, no, understood.
Well, they are trying to.
Yeah.
And I would just to answer, not to answer, but just to support your view. I think street markets are the lifeblood of an area, and they need no infrastructure, they need no money to make them happen. They're you can appropriate a street or a square with a market, and yes, but maybe part of the policy or part of the programming of an architect scheme should be to design them back.
So since we want to conclude on a positive note, right? And as you've noticed, every time you ask Richard a question, architecture is not necessarily the first thing he thinks about, but the way he's intervened in public life has been through architecture. And to take your last point, Richard, would be very interesting. I mean, in many ways, you do say it right at the beginning of the book, Richard Brown and you in your opening paragraphs, that actually sustainability is at the heart of everything you're saying. And just to be fair or self-critical, we haven't talked about the environmental side that much. But screwing you down to talking about architecture.
No, I thought very sustainable.
As in terms of a final reflection, where does the design of buildings, given that you're here with your practice, which is at the forefront of environmentally sensitive designs, where does architecture and urban planning, what role does it play in dealing with the climate change question?
Maybe I'll divide into two. I think the first, to be brief, I often say there's more to architecture than architecture. In other words, there's more to architecture than buildings. It is spaces in between them, it is a sustainability, it's a broad subject. And we have to treat it as such. Clearly we don't have that much power, we have some power. Some of us have done a little bit more than others, but overall we have difficulties, whether it's markets, your point, and on the whole, I don't think that the architect can do very much in the sense of just leaving a wider route, but we can do something about telling the local borough that we demand to have that space. We can have what I call march, but you don't have to march physically. You can do it in other ways of communication. You can only do it by accepting that that's part of architecture. Now, I think it's part of a whole lot of things, economics and so on, as well as that. In terms of climate change, I suppose we can at one level, apart from our president in the States, we can at one level saying we're getting better. I mean, we are, the cost of solar energy is coming down at some tremendous speed. There is much talk now of stopping the gas guzzling car. So there are ways, and there is sort of the beginning to be loops of, let's say, I'm more optimistic there. Again, it won't happen, except if there are rules, because if in the end, which is what's happening, and I do remember this when I first went out, when I was, again, probably 40 or 50 years ago, I went out to the Middle East where actually water was more expensive than gas. When we get to that price, only governments can step in. They can only say, you can't buy petrol, to use gas. You can't buy petrol at a price less than water, because if water has no implication, let's say, on climate change, it has plenty of implication, obviously, on growth of food. Then governments, we have to persuade governments, and we have to take change, and we personally have to feel each one of us responsible for doing better.
Right, on that note, I want to bring the evening to an end, also to allow some of you to come up and get your books signed. The books, as I say, are being sold outside by Canongate. So I'm only one thing left for me to do is to thank the publishers for arranging this event in terms of the book being here, and beautifully done. Congratulations for that. Beautiful book. Thank the organizers here at the LSE and at the practice, Rogers Stirk Harbour, for helping a lot. But obviously join me now in thanking the three speakers, Amanda, Alan,